Well, welcome to part two of Epic Stories and Product Management. In this part of the topic, we're going to look at how we can split our big epics to maintain value. In the previous part of this topic, we were interested in what is a ready story and what does it mean to invest in a story. Our goal is, of course, to have these lovely thin slices of functionality, and that invest criteria helps us note if we've got it right. Now, let's take what an epic is. An epic, of course, is a big story. So as a user story, it should also be a big slice through the system. Our problem is, of course, it's not right-sized or small enough to be delivered in a single sprint or iteration. So we need to be able to split the story. And therefore, we need to be able to split that big epic story into something that we can make ready, that meets that invest criteria. Some people take the approach when they have a big epic story that, we can split that story by development phases. So we'll split it as an analysis story, then we'll have a design story, then we'll have an implementation story, and then we'll have a test story. Well, the problem with that is you do not have anything that's actually going to execute until you've finished that test story. So that could be at least 4 sprints, maybe more, before you have anything to show to the stakeholder. And that could really delay feedback and learning. And if you recall, the whole goal of pursuing Agile and using user stories is that we can quickly deliver these thin slices of the system so that we could show it to our stakeholder, learn what's really valuable, and help us keep towards that valuable green and less towards that wasteful red. So that's not a strategy we want to pursue. So I'd like to offer you 3 strategies here that will help us take those big epics and split them into valuable child stories that can be ready for sprint planning, that meet that invest criteria. The first one I call model-driven. The second one I call acceptance criteria-driven. And the third one I call low-fidelity, high-fidelity. Now that's what I call these. You'll have various other people call them very different things, or when I describe them, you'll see, oh yeah, that looks just like, that's fine. But this is the way I would categorize them. So the first one I refer to as model-driven. Now, you may think that, geez, I really didn't think Agile and model went in the same sentence. And I want to say this. I want to make it clear. Modeling did not go out of fashion just with the invention of Agile. Agile probably actually made modeling sane once again. But the whole point of developing models is that it is a cheaper and faster way, under some circumstances, to learn about the system. And we can use models to help us split stories. For example, we have here this user story. As a traveler, I want to upgrade my seat. And we say, well, this is a huge epic. This is going to take us several sprints to implement, and it really is not right-sized or small. Okay, fine. What we can do is we can actually describe that user story with a use case. And for those of you who are not familiar with use cases, a use case is a model that describes how an actor of a system reaches a goal using that system. And the description of the use case is usually as a set of scenarios. So it is a dialogue, like a script of what the actor does and what the system does. And it's organized as a collection of scenarios. So this is just a lovely way of understanding a user story, an epic user story, and then being able to use the information or that model to split the story. Because of course, each one of those scenarios we can say is probably valuable. There's usually what we call a main success scenario. So that's the way things normally get done. So that in itself right there can become a user story, or it'd be a good candidate for a user story. And then also the use case will list a series of alternative scenarios, different ways that the actor can reach their goal. And each one of those scenarios in themselves can become a user story. So here's a lovely strategy. You first take the main success scenario. That is our first candidate user story. So that we can split the epic into, the main success scenario is one child, and the alternatives as additional children. A lovely side benefit of this strategy is maybe not all of those alternatives are valuable. So you can actually defer the implementation of those alternatives to discover maybe this alternative here, why isn't that red? While it's a nice idea, maybe it's not as valuable, and there's something else that's more valuable that we can implement in instead. So this is one of the lovely things that I love about models and this approach of model-driven. The other approach is so-called acceptance criteria. Remember, a user story has a set of acceptance criteria that come from the conversations with the stakeholders and the product owner. Well, each one of these captures something that is valuable to the stakeholder or the product owner. So we can use these, for example, to split a large epic story into smaller epics or to smaller stories. So if each one of the acceptance criteria are valuable, then a child story that implements part of the story constrained by only that acceptance criteria in itself will be valuable. So this is another lovely technique that you have. Finally, the other technique I'm referring to as low fidelity, high fidelity, is simply the idea of we can take a user story, and this is a much more technical approach, that we can take the user story and first do a low fidelity implementation. So for example, maybe a low fidelity implementation of the user story starts with a simple text-based UI or a database that's fixed size rather than variable, or we don't do any error checking. Some of us think that many of our vendors don't do error checking, but that's another matter altogether. But the intent is we limit the technical implementation so that we can get some functional demonstration out quickly. Now this is more than just prototyping. This means we're putting a low fidelity implementation out there and then iterating and incrementally increasing the fidelity to create a higher fidelity version until we have the full technical implementation of the original user story. So the children user stories are lower fidelity implementations of the parent user story or the epic. Another term that you may have heard used in this context is the so-called walking skeleton. So there's a list of 20 techniques here that are available to you. This actually comes from a blog that was written by Bill Wake. It's available at this website, sort of giving you suggestions of how you can start with sort of a more low fidelity implementation and iteratively and incrementally create a higher fidelity implementation. So this is another way to split a user story that is valuable. So you've got three techniques here: the model-driven, the acceptance criteria-driven, and the more technically focused low fidelity, high fidelity approach. These approaches don't necessarily have to are used mutually exclusive of one another. You can combine these techniques such that you can take a large epic and start refining it down into smaller child user stories, each of which is still valuable and each of which can be delivered in a single sprint. And this is how we preserve value. These techniques are how we can preserve value in delivering these user stories and getting that valuable feedback, such that are we still in that green, or are we navigating over or falling over into that wasteful red?